All right, it is a pleasure to welcome to the Colts official podcast Brad Spielberger from Pro Football Focus. In my mind, one of the smartest people out there when it comes to evaluating free agency, NFL contracts. You can follow him on Twitter at PFF_Brad, and a Chicago guy. So happy to have you on here, Brad.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I think that round of applause was for Brad.
It was for
Brad.
Brad.
You just heard. That's
Absolutely.
what it is, yeah. So to paint the picture, we are within the NFL Combine, and we are at the bench press. So
Yes.
you will hear some grunting and some clapping and some raucous activity over our shoulders.
And it's mostly going to be cheering on Brad as we talk about free agency. Again, we are recording this at the NFL Combine, so this episode is coming out on Tuesday. We're recording this a couple days before, but we wanted to get a chance to sit down with Brad and kind of talk through some things to expect in free agency. And so I just want to start here, Brad. I've got your top 200 free agents pulled up on Pro Football Focus. For any fan listening to this, go check this out. This is one of the best resources out there. He's got scheme fits, he's got recent injury history, contract projections, all those things. When you look at this free agent class as a whole, what defines it in terms of positions of strength, maybe some positions of weakness that teams are going to be looking at?
Yeah, I would say overall it's not a great class, but there's a lot of depth. So the top 20, 30 guys, maybe not great players, but a lot of depth. I think in terms of positions of strength, it was wide receiver. Obviously a bunch of injuries now is kind of, Michael Gallup and Odell Beckham Jr., but tight end as well. It sounds like maybe some franchise tags in play there, but a lot of good tight ends in this class.
Brad, you are one who is great about examining the cap, and that is something that the Colts give, a lot of credit to Mike Bloom, who manages that as part of the Colts organization. And it takes a lot of creativity at some points to navigate that, but he really enforces cash over cap. Can you put in perspective the Colts situation right now with they had a number of big signings last offseason. You locked up Darius Leonard, Braden Smith, Nyheim Hines. We know that there's that conversation about Quentin Nelson, of course, with that contract looming here over the next few months. How well-positioned are the Colts with what they have available this offseason?
Yeah, so their philosophy is to match the catch to the cap. So they want to, instead of pushing money down the line, they want it to be pretty neutral. And that gives them flexibility. If they want to get aggressive, they can then look like the Saints and the Eagles where they're pushing things down the line and that. But they've done a great job with all those early extensions you mentioned from that phenomenal 2018 draft class. And getting all those deals done enables them to focus on Quentin and then, maybe some external guys. Braden Smith and Darius Leonard, they did set the market or come close to it at their positions, but I think those deals are going to age pretty well in the near future.
So something that Chris Ballard talked about this week as he was talking about free agency and the Colts approach is that they're willing to overpay, but they're not really willing to overcommit. And the thing he specifically mentioned is, quote, it's just when you straddle yourself with 3 years of guaranteed money because that's where free agency is going for the high-priced guys, and then you miss on it and you leave yourself no out, then that strangles you going forward. So when you think about that approach and how teams are structuring these contracts, if you aren't willing to go deep into guarantees in that third year, does that leave you short of certain guys, or are there different ways to kind of get around that?
So it goes back to the last question where because Indy is not giving big signing bonuses and doesn't have first-year cash flows that are matching some of these other teams, they probably have to guarantee money in later years to match the full guarantee of the deal. It does. It complicates matters, and like he said, that is the trend. We saw, T.J. Watt made this big effort to get guarantees in the third year. Obviously, he's, in a class of his own, but that is going to be the push to get more and more guarantees in later years for those assurances for the players. And once a guy hits free agency and is on the open market, you have to compete, you have to overpay because that's just the nature of free agency.
And the interesting aspect is that it's a two-way street in free agency. It's not just that the team has to have the money to pay and the interest in that player and the commitment to that player. The player has to want to come to that team too. In your opinion, what makes the Colts an appealing landing spot at what free agency positions, and then what are some of those things that the Colts might have to answer if they are pursuing free agents at certain positions that would ultimately help lure them there if they can address those issues?
Yeah, I think the Colts have a great infrastructure. I think it's a stable organization. Even with this entire tenure of, not having a quarterback at certain times, they've still been a winning organization that entire time, and so I think that stands out. They also tend to stick by their guys. He mentioned getting strapped with maybe deals into the third year. They don't cut guys early. They're not trading players away. They try to build with their own guys, and you can see that in the moves they make. Everyone says that. The Colts actually do it. In terms of how you attract free agents, to Indy, I think Frank Reich is a huge piece of that. I think players love him, love playing for him, and I think Ballard as well. I mean, he is one of the more open general managers in the NFL, and you get the vibe that he's open with his players as well. And there's some GMs that are not really talking to their guys, and there's kind of not that connection. I think it's an attractive place, but of course, depending on the position, obviously, if you're an offensive weapon, maybe it's a bit of a question mark at this point.
Defensively, with the addition of Gus Bradley, inherits a strong defensive foundation from Matt Eberflus. With what we know of Gus Bradley and how he's developed defenses, what might make this appealing at what type of defensive positions that you have free agents this year?
Sure, yeah. So we saw with Gus Bradley in Las Vegas, he brings that cover 3 system, that infamous Seattle cover 3 system, and it's great for cornerbacks. It is, we saw Casey Hayward with a bounce back year last year in Las Vegas. I'm not going to say it's easy on the corners, but if you're a good zone corner that can, manage the field and kind of play in space, it's great. And it's revitalized a lot of careers, and I think that's the attractive piece there.
So if we're sticking to that topic, one of the things you have in here that I mentioned is scheme fit. So when you're thinking about cornerbacks who might be available in free agency, and you got to think about scheme fit. It's not just let's go out and get the best corner, because if you go get a guy who plays mostly man, yeah, there's some man match stuff that Gus Bradley does, but you're thinking more a zone corner. So throw a couple names out there for us then.
Yeah, I think Steven Nelson in Philadelphia was with Pittsburgh before, had a good year on a one-year flyer, and I think is a good fit in zone. Also, Rasul Douglas, was drafted to be a man cover corner. Obviously did not go great to start his career. Maybe can't get re-signed to Green Bay because of all the obligations they have there. They were a heavy zone scheme last year, and he had kind of a breakout season. So those are two names I'd probably keep an eye on.
Rasul Douglas, by the way, he was the one who signed off the Cardinals practice squad, then ended that game in Arizona with an interception of Kyler Murray. So just a little note on him there.
Well, you're mentioning Kyler Murray. There's, of course, a lot of conversations surrounding him and his future with Arizona. This current quarterback climate, there are a lot of teams that are quarterback needy in certain situations. When you think about the retirement of guys like Ben Roethlisberger, Tom Brady, how do you explain the landscape that there is within the competition for quarterbacks and the market that there is for free agency quarterbacks, how slim that might be, and the likelihood of making any major trades, what it would command to get some of the guys who are those top-tier quarterbacks that a lot of people are probably going to try to target?
Yeah, I think that's how the landscape has changed. That at this point, if Aaron Rodgers or Russell Wilson gets moved, I'd be pretty surprised.
Yeah.
I think now you're looking at probably Jimmy Garoppolo as the best quarterback that could realistically get moved. And you look at free agency, it's not a great class either. Generally, there's not great classes in quarterback free agency. You wouldn't be a free agent if you were a great quarterback. But, I think there is belief league-wide that Mitchell Trubisky, had these issues in Chicago, but then the issues persisted when he was no longer there. So it seems to be the belief that maybe another team could get their hands on him and turn him around. But, yeah, it's tough to add a quarterback, again, as the Colts know very well, to add a quarterback through those means. But, you got to make the phone calls and see if you can get a price tag on a guy. But, yeah, the Russell Wilson, Aaron Rodgers guys, there's almost maybe not a price tag that's possible to get them. You can only trade picks 3 years into the future, and those guys might be worth, 5 first-round picks.
Yeah.
With the quarterback class that you have in 2022, a lot of people were saying this is a weaker quarterback class altogether. With this week at the NFL Combine, of the quarterback class, who has the most to gain in not only getting out on the field and performing in all of the different disciplines, but also sitting down with those NFL head coaches, having those meetings? Who are those quarterbacks that you think could make the biggest leap, perhaps?
I think it's Malik Willis. I was down in Mobile at the Senior Bowl, and just he has some physical tools the rest of this class just does not have. A raw player, but also a guy. There's been reports that the teams were surprised by how good he was on the whiteboard and talking through football, and they shouldn't be surprised. We've heard that he is very cerebral, knows exactly what he's doing on the field, but I think he's gaining that steam and kind of building that reputation now as a guy that probably won't want to sit for a little bit and kind of bring along slowly, but has the potential to be a franchise quarterback.
How important are opportunities like the Senior Bowl and the Combine in particular for guys who come out of smaller schools, where it seems like the biggest question on those guys like Malik Willis is, can he go with those guys who are coming out of the Power 5 as opposed to the guys you're seeing who are coming out of the large schools who are going against that top-tier talent? It's, as we always hear from our scouts, like things like the Senior Bowl with Combine, apples to apples comparison, where you're able to see him throw alongside those other guys coming out of the more major programs?
Yeah, I think it works both ways where, obviously the competition is a step up, and I think the big thing that Willis proved in Mobile was that wasn't an issue. Playing against better defenders, guys that are going to get drafted, and was still making throws, but also at the same time, his offensive line in Liberty did him no justice and was not helpful, and so him having more time and more room to operate, he really elevated his game, and I think showed he belongs with all those guys.
I'm going to talk about some guys who might protect the quarterback because, you're looking at what the Colts are going to try to accomplish in free agency. They need to find a solution at left tackle with Eric Fisher becoming a free agent, Mark Lewinsky at right guard. Where do you see those two guys specifically fit in the larger free agent landscape? Like how much competition, if the Colts, by the time this episode comes out, they have not, maybe made a move to re-sign them. If they do hit the open market, where do you see those guys fitting in, again, in the larger free agent landscape? So
Fisher's interesting because Teron Armstead with the New Orleans Saints, before Sean Payton retired, I would have told you there's no chance he's going anywhere. Now maybe the calculus changes. I mean, he's a potential $20 million per year guy at left tackle. And are you making that commitment with the highest paid right tackle in football and maybe not a quarterback on the roster? So if he hits free agency, then that maybe bumps Fisher down a peg. If not, Fisher is the premier left tackle on the market. I do think Indianapolis, though, with that 1 year flyer for him coming off the Achilles, I think the plan was to bring him back, and I think they're going to get something done.
One thing we learned at the Combine from Colts general manager Chris Ballard was that T.Y. Hilton does want to continue playing football from the last conversation that they had, and that he has a lot of belief that T.Y. has great football still ahead of him. And part of that, not only the physical traits that T.Y. has, but the mentality of T.Y. Hilton. When T.Y. was a free agent last offseason, Baltimore was one of those aggressively pursuing him. Where do you see the demand being potentially for a T.Y. Hilton, a veteran receiver who's coming off of that neck injury that limited his 2021 season?
I think at this point he's playing on consecutive one-year deals. I don't think there's a multi-year deal in his future, which is probably what he's looking for as well. I don't think the 1 year 10 or 1 year 8 up to 10 is on the market again. We saw it with Larry Fitzgerald in Arizona. As time went on, that the 1 year flyers got a little bit smaller. I think that's probably a similar situation. But I also thought Chris Ballard really stamped the table for how much he believes in Paris Campbell and a lot of the guys they have in-house. But I do think they'll try to get something done with Hilton as well.
How about tight end, if we're thinking about playmakers too, where we don't know what Jack Doyle's status will be, whether he will retire or not. More like Cox set to hit free agency. So the Colts theoretically could have some openings there, especially for that inline blocking tight end. What's this class like at tight end in terms of the depth and the star talent that could become available?
Yeah, I think it is arguably the greatest free agent class at tight end we've ever seen. And part of that is because obviously the position is coming along and it is now getting addressed more and drafted higher and all those things. As far as blocking tight ends, the Carolina Panthers deal with Ian Thomas, 3 years, $16.95 million, changes the calculus for everyone. I mean, it raises the floor quite high. And I think now everyone that saw that deal, Mo Alley-Cox included, obviously not as much of an inline guy, more of a receiver, but those tight ends are going to get paid this offseason.
A year ago, Danico Autry and Justin Houston were a couple of guys who explored free agency and ultimately ended up leaving the Indianapolis Colts. Danico going to Tennessee, and then Justin Houston finding a new role in Baltimore. It seemed like at the end of the offseason that Chris Ballard put a lot of emphasis on that edge position and the importance of having not only a veteran presence, but also depth. Last year they drafted Kwity Paye and Dio Adangbo. If the Colts are pursuing the free agent options all along the defensive line, particularly at edge rusher, what type of market will this be if that is an area that Chris Ballard does decide to prioritize and make a move for?
Yeah, so there's a decent group there. More older guys, though. I mean, it sounds like Von Miller will probably be back with the Rams. But, Chandler Jones, I think, is going to hit the market and maybe not return to Arizona. And then you look at guys like Emmanuel Ogbah as a potential guy to reach the market in Miami. There's some names there, but I will say that is a position where you're overpaying in free agency every single time. And some deals work out, but it's a tricky, situation to navigate at edge rusher.
So when you think about free agency, just in general, there's this mentality out there of like, well, these guys are hitting the market for a reason. The teams don't want them back. But that's not always the case. Some teams do have cap issues that they need to address. You mentioned the New Orleans Saints with Teron Armstead. Of course, they would love to have him back. Can they afford to bring him back within the constraints of their cap? Things like that. Are there certain guys out there who are hitting the market not because the team that they played for, the last year, whatever it's been, doesn't want them back, but because the team they played for can't get them back?
I would say the thing that maybe folks overlook as well is that even if you can afford it, teams don't want to break their precedent to where they're paying so much for a guy and the next guys coming up are then looking at those numbers and trying to replicate that. So even if they can afford it, can they afford to set the precedent where everyone's looking for more money and things like that? So there's not really any guys that I think are going to leave strictly because the team can't afford to bring them back. I think Green Bay is probably the only team that might be in that situation.
What about like in terms of coaching changes where you go from one offensive staff to another, and now it's a different scheme. You go from one defensive staff to another, now it's a different scheme. Are there certain guys who could be good scheme fits, maybe here in Indianapolis, who were good scheme fits where they were, and now all of a sudden maybe are not?
100%. I mean, I think Gus Bradley's defense is different than Eberflus,
Right.
and Bradley loves to bring his guys back in the fold. I mentioned Casey Hayward. He had Darius Philon in Las Vegas last year as well, and I think he will reach out to those guys and bring some of his people along. I think also underrated as well is general managers want to get their guys in the building, and they're not tethered to former players that were drafted or signed by the prior general manager. Maybe to a fault where they want to get all their guys in the building, but I think they want to put their imprint on the roster pretty much right away.
Well, the portion that the fans get to see are the things like media availability, and they'll get to see, the 40 and, the bench press and all of the activity that we have going on. So much of the combine is about the conversations that happen away from Lucas Oil Stadium and away from the convention center. The new league year doesn't begin until March 16th. How many of these conversations are happening this week between you have, GMs and head coaches and agents that are all here and discussing those things to some degree, getting a gauge on the interest that there is even prior to things being official?
Yeah, so obviously by the rule book, you can only negotiate with your current pending free agents. But yes, I mean, some of those conversations are happening. Again, nothing where you're talking out details or anything like that, but definitely trying to gauge the market, get an understanding of where other teams view certain players, and as you mentioned too, how the guy fits. Is he going to leave the team he's on because he's no longer a fit? One example I think is Mike Gesicki in Miami. I think they would love to have him back, but they're going to that wide zone rushing attack. He's not a blocker, and so like things like that, you try to gauge not the numbers and dollars and cents, but just who's actually going to be available.
The last thing I want to ask you about, Brad, is when you were with Over the Cap, you did a lot of work on comp picks. You were always my go-to guy in Chicago to be like, can you explain this to me? Like, how is this going to work out? I believe the Colts are slated to get a couple comp picks this year for free agents leaving last year. Danico Autry and Jacoby Brissett, I believe. When you look around the scope of the league, certain teams it seems like do value that, letting a free agent go and then recouping that comp pick. New England is the most famous example of that. I think Baltimore does it quite a bit. When you approach free agency that way, how does that affect the business that you might be able to do, whether it's maybe not in the first wave of free agency, but waiting until that May cutoff line? Like that focus on comp picks for certain teams, how does that affect their approach?
Yeah, so a perfect example is Eric Fisher, because also you have to be a truly unrestricted free agent to count in the compensatory pick formula. If you were cut by your team, you don't count. So those guys have an added value where you bring them in. It doesn't affect your formula. But yes, the teams are very cognizant of that. The May deadline is actually a new deadline from the new CBA. It used to be in July, and players said, look, there's this dead market, and teams are waiting to sign us, and they want to sign us, but they're making us wait just because they don't want to impact their comp picks. Teams are very cognizant of that. The Colts are very, very cognizant of the comp pick situation.
We had to wait to see a combine back here 2 years long to see Indianapolis again host the combine for you. Best part about just getting back to this week, being on site, getting to have these conversations, but also looking at guys firsthand, having all of the conversations and evaluations that you are.
Yeah, it's funny. You hear a lot of the the buzzwords and the idioms about like being in person, just the way you can really get to know a person and get to know people in person, but it's real. I mean, just seeing these guys up close, asking them questions, hearing how they respond to things and how their thought process, it's different. And it's important to really get to know the person. Like you mentioned, the interviews and stuff like that might be more important than the testing.
Brad Spielberger from Pro Football Focus. Follow him on Twitter at PFF_Brad. Read him on Pro Football Focus. Again, this guide to 2022 free agency is going to be how I'm going to get through it, frankly, and it's how you should get through it too if you're listening to this. So, Brad, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.